After the armistice in November 1918, Britain remembered its 750,000 war dead in more than 37,000 memorials. Almost every town and village has one, a poignant reminder of a lost generation, a permanent monument to their bravery and sacrifice. But in Tavistock Square in central London, there's a very unusual and far more contentious memorial. Very few people know about this memorial. Most simply walk past, and those that do notice it may not be entirely comfortable with its sentiment, because this memorial commemorates the lives of those determined not to fight, the conscientious objectors, or conchies, as they were popularly but not affectionately known. In this film, I'm going to investigate the lives of some of these men. And ask, 90 years on, were they cowards and shirkers? Or were they, in their own way, courageous for refusing to join the fight? When the British government began its recruitment drive in 1914, it was overwhelmed by the patriotic response. At the start of the war, there was no question of conscription, of forcing men to sign up. The French may have done it, and the Germans certainly had no qualms. But the British Army felt it just wasn't British. One War Office minister said conscription was foreign to the British nation, to the British character, and to the genius of our people. 2 years of slaughter on the Western Front destroyed such romantic notions. Such were the casualties, the government had to take extreme measures. In 1916, Parliament approved the Military Service Act, a radical piece of legislation, forcibly enlisting all unmarried men aged 18 to 41. The original act is kept at the Parliamentary Archives. It was pretty all-encompassing, though there were some exemptions. A, on the grounds that your job was in the national interest. B, on the grounds that if you were called up, your dependents would be destitute. C, on the grounds of your ill health or infirmity. And D, here it is, the unexpected one, on the ground of a conscientious objection to the undertaking of combatant service. The conscientious objector, as we know it, was born. 16,000 conscientious objectors applied for exemption. They fell into two categories. Those who refused to do anything to help the war effort, men known as absolutists, and those prepared to do non-combat work, alternativists. It's not widely remembered, but several thousand conscientious objectors served in non-combat roles at the front. As stretcher bearers on the battlefield, as labourers in a specially formed non-combatant corps, and as medics and orderlies. 18-year-old Cedric Vipont Brown was a Quaker, a member of the Society of Friends. He was morally opposed to war on religious grounds. In 1914, Cedric joined the Friends Ambulance Unit. It provided alternative service for those not prepared to fight. I'm meeting Cedric's daughter, Susan Hartshorn.
I have a picture here of the Friends Ambulance Unit at the training camp in Buckinghamshire in 1914, and there's my father in the middle of the front row. Mm. Yeah.
They do look like any other group of young men who've joined up.
Well, I don't think they were very much different from any other group of young men.
Over 1,000 men joined the ranks of the FAU. They may have worn uniforms, but the volunteers were very much civilians. They worked at the front, unarmed and unpaid. It was a dangerous task. Cedric himself was wounded and gassed while recovering casualties.
He'd never seen such carnage, and in fact, in his diary, he says so. The sight of some 15 badly wounded persons lying in a row in what used to be a stable is a sight I will never forget. It is war stripped of all glory, leaving its cruel, bloody and repulsive self.
It sounds as though the job required quite a lot of courage, which isn't necessarily what people would say, oh, conscientious objectors, they were trying to avoid it. That's not true.
I don't think that's true. I think he was a brave man, but then I wouldn't I?
Cedric served with the FAU for 4 years. But when he encouraged his younger brother Ralph, a medical student, to join up, he refused. Ralph felt the Friends Ambulance Unit was too militaristic. He didn't believe that conscientious objectors should be patching up the wounded just to return them to the war. So instead, Ralph joined the Friends War Relief Service, another Quaker-run outfit which dealt only with civilian victims of the war. Ralph wanted to do his bit to help, but he didn't want to help the army. In 1916, Ralph began work at a Quaker-run maternity hospital at Chalon-sur-Marne in northern France. It seems remarkable that anything approaching normal life could go on so close to the front. But despite the danger of shelling and air raids, almost 1,000 babies were born at Chalon during the war. While there, Ralph kept a diary in which he condemned what he called the unspeakable slaughter. "When shall we come to our senses?" he wrote. "The self-willed suicide of the human race continues, each nation blaming the other like children. When will men realize how disastrously they have misled themselves?" This is Les Baraques military cemetery in Calais. It contains over 1,500 graves. This is a typical row of graves that you might find in any Commonwealth military cemetery. There are men from the Gordon Highlanders, the Australian Infantry, the Royal Engineers. But this one seems a little out of place. It's Ralph Vipont Brown. The inscription begins, "Peace, peace." With some irony, the man who didn't want to work with soldiers is buried forever alongside them. In March 1919, Ralph contracted the Spanish flu on duty in France. He died within days, a victim of an epidemic that took 20 million lives. Ralph's sacrifice has been honoured today, even though he was a conscientious objector. But where should we draw the line? Should we also remember the men who stubbornly refused to help the war effort in any capacity? The absolutists. Is it right to commemorate them too?
London's mad with excitement now. People rushing to join up.
When the Conscription Act was passed in 1916, uniquely in England, it gave conscientious objectors the legal right to refuse to fight. But every man who sought exemption from the ranks had to prove his integrity before a panel of local dignitaries, known as a tribunal. Towards the end of the interview, every conscientious objector was asked the killer question, designed to shame them out of their feebleness. What would you do if a German soldier attacked your mother? Would you stand up and protect her, or would you let her be raped and killed? Some men cracked and admitted they'd do anything to protect their family. Other men said it was an unfair question. But amazingly, the most hard-line conscientious objectors said, yes, they would let their mother be killed rather than take another man's life. 26-year-old Bert Brocklesby was one of the very first men to apply for absolute exemption on conscientious grounds. He was the second of 4 sons, born to Hannah and John Brocklesby, a successful grocer in the town of Conisbrough, South Yorkshire. During the course of the war, 174 Conisbrough men lost their lives in the trenches of the Western Front. And Bert, in his determination not to fight, would come close to losing his. When war was declared in 1914, the men of Conisbrough enthusiastically answered the national call to arms. Bert's older brother, George, tried to join up, but was disappointed to be turned down on medical grounds. He became the local recruiting officer and in due course signed up brothers Phil and Harold. But Bert, who was eligible to fight, refused to volunteer. He said, "God did not put me on earth to go destroying his own children." Religion was fundamental to Bert Brocklesby. Although a teacher by profession, he spent much of his time at the Conisbrough Methodist Chapel, where he was organist and choirmaster. Bert was a popular member of the congregation, until, that is, he was invited to preach a sermon, and took the opportunity to make public his objection to the war. One evening in January 1915, Bert stood here and preached a sermon that would really challenge his congregation. These were people who believed they should live their lives in imitation of Christ. All right, he said, can you imagine Christ dressed in army uniform? No. Can you imagine Christ armed with a machine gun? Probably not. Can you imagine Christ bayoneting a German soldier? No. That picture, he said, is impossible, and we all know it. Bert's audience were simply stunned by his sermon. One member of the congregation dared to say what many of them were probably thinking. Bert's only preached it because he's too frightened to go himself. Bert was not invited to preach in Conisbrough again.
Perhaps you wonder what I am. I will explain to you. My conscience is the only thing that helps to pull me through.
The growing hostility towards the COs was captured in a popular song, the Conscientious Objectors' Lament.
I don't object to fighting hands, but should hate them fighting me. Send out the army and the navy, send out the rank and file, send out my brother, my sister and my mother, but for God's sake don't send me.
As the national mood hardened, Bert's family received a white feather in the post, the traditional symbol of cowardice. But despite the stigma, they stood by him. For Bert, absolutism was not just a question of religious conviction. It was also a matter of individual liberty. Bert believed in the inalienable right of every Englishman to follow his conscience and not be bullied by government. An admirable sentiment, but one totally incompatible with military thinking. In May 1916, Bert was ordered to work as a labourer in the Army's Non-combatant Corps, known derisively by fighting men as the No Courage Corps. But even this work was too militaristic for Bert. He refused to join up and was immediately arrested. This is Richmond in North Yorkshire, famous for its medieval castle. In 1916, the castle was used as a military prison, holding a group of 16 of the most determined conscientious objectors. Among them, Bert Brocklesby.
We know exactly which cell Bert Brocklesby was held in because while he was here, he graffitied the walls. Very upmarket graffiti, obviously. And he drew two pictures, which incredibly are still here. They're very, very fragile, but you can still see them very clearly. One is of Annie Wainwright, his girlfriend. And we know it's him because he's written J.H. Brocklesby, fake it, i.e. Latin, he did it, 22nd, 5, 1916. The other picture, which shows the other thing that was on his mind, is even more extraordinary. And it's a picture here of Christ stumbling on the way to Golgotha, and Bert's drawn Christ oppressed by the weight of the cross, by the weight of his suffering. And I think that's how Bert must have been feeling about his own incarceration here.
I've arranged to meet up with Bert's nephew, Malcolm Brocklesby. You knew Bert. What was he like?
Well, my memory of him is that he was a large, avuncular character.
Yeah.
And when he was around, there was usually a lot of laughter.
Right, so he wasn't dour. You get this image of a very serious, earnest man.
He could be serious at times, but he was certainly not a dour character.
Do you feel his conscientious objection was something that was absolutely rigid?
The key thing was, thou shalt not kill. The other thing was that he said, you will demonstrate your Christianity by what you actually do.
Right.
And I think this was this strong basic principle on one hand, and the belief that you've got to demonstrate that with your behaviour that came together.
Hence his determination to resist.
Yes, there's a stubborn streak trying to get out from time to time.
The army tried to break Bert's resolve, constantly pressing him to sign up. In response, he and the other absolutists began a campaign of passive resistance. They refused to dress in uniform. They would not go out on parade. Bert even refused to peel potatoes.
The prisoners kept up their spirits, not just by drawing on the walls, but by praying and singing together. Bert's neighbour, Norman Gordy, led the singing and tapped out the rhythm on the concrete floor. Their favourite, apparently, was Nearer My God to Thee, with Bert providing a rousing bass.
While Bert continued his protest, his younger brothers, Harold and Phil, prepared for the Somme offensive. They were among 400,000 men who gathered along an 18-mile front. This would be, the army hoped, the big push, the decisive battle to end the whole war. Bert, too, found himself involved. Unable to break his resistance, the army came up with a bizarre plan. The prisoners were brought here, to the port of Boulogne in northern France, where thousands of troops were stationed before heading off to the Somme. Incredibly, Bert and his fellow prisoners were allowed time off to look round the town, as though they were tourists. They came down here to the beach, went for a paddle, played football, and being English, pooled their money together and had a nice cup of tea. Quite what the British troops stationed here thought of all this is difficult to imagine. But the beach holiday didn't last long. Bert and the other prisoners were marched to the top of the cliffs overlooking the harbour, where an army camp had been set up. Here, in what is today a children's park, they faced a military court, charged with disobedience. On the 24th of June 1916, Bert Brocklesby was ordered into the parade ground, where hundreds of soldiers had gathered to hear the court's verdict. The captain read out the sentence of the court. The accused, he said, are found guilty and sentenced to death. Bert was one of at least 50 absolutists sentenced to death during the war. But none of the sentences were ever carried out. It was, in truth, a sham, pure theatre, an exercise in intimidation. Bert was transferred to Dice Work Camp near Aberdeen to begin a sentence of hard labour. The absolutists were often badly treated in prison. Many guards were unsympathetic former soldiers, and physical abuse of conchies was commonplace. 73 conscientious objectors died as a result of their punishment. Several committed suicide. The harsh treatment received by the absolutists still provokes conflicting reactions, from "that's terrible" to "so what?" Yes, Bert and his fellow COs suffered for their pacifist beliefs, but millions of men on the front line believed, or at least trusted, that their efforts would bring about peace in Europe. So how much sympathy do the absolutists deserve? While Bert served his sentence, his brothers Harold and Phil were in the trenches. On the 1st of July 1916, the men of Conisbrough went over the top at the Somme. In that day alone, 60,000 men were killed or wounded. Phil later wrote home, "Hell, that's what it was. Long, horrible wars like this one are one of the strongest arguments for conscientious objectors." Harold and Phil survived. They were incredibly lucky. Huge numbers of families were left in mourning. One can't help wonder how Bert would have felt if one or both of his brothers had been killed. Would that have challenged the certainty of his pacifism? Or would it have made him even more stubborn in his convictions? Absolutists like Bert took their religion to the extreme. Most men of faith set aside any reservations they had about taking life to serve what they believed was a greater good. But what if, once in the midst of battle, their convictions changed? What if a soldier began to question the morality of the war? What if doing his patriotic duty turned him into a conscientious objector? This is the Imperial War Museum in London, one of the world's leading military archives. Here we can find evidence of a soldier who became a conscientious objector during his service in the Great War. In the reading room, there's a remarkable memoir written by war veteran Ronald Skirth. He dedicated it to his wartime girlfriend and future wife, Ella Christian. Skirth recounts how, as a naive young recruit, he was trained not just physically, but mentally too. He writes, "The chaplains had convinced me of the righteousness of our cause and assured us that God would grant us the victory we deserved. They preached to us that it was His will, that the Germans, those fiends in human form, should be destroyed. I really did think that I and my friends were protecting our sisters and our sweethearts from fates worse than death. Ronald Skirth trained as an artillery observer. At the front, it would be his job to find enemy targets and direct the battery's shell fire. Jean Skirth is Ronald's only daughter.
Hello.
Hello, Jean.
I recognise your face.
Very nice to meet Jean.
Jean has kept some of the more personal sections of her father's war memoir.
You've got the very first page of his memoir, and is that your parents?
Yes, that's my mother, Ella, and that's Dad. Pictures especially taken before he joined the army.
They look terribly young,
Yes.
and almost like children.
Yes, well, they did actually meet at a musical evening.
Right.
He fell in love with her. And he's written what time it was, 7 o'clock on the 26th of July in 1916. And she sang and he played the piano. No, I mean, how more romantic
Could you get? Absolutely.
Just a few months after meeting Ella, Ronald Skirth volunteered for what he saw as a great adventure. He took with him a treasured possession, a book of poetry.
And this is a copy of The Golden Treasury by F.T. Palgrave. It's got his name and as you can
What's
see...
he interested in? The romantics.
Well, the romantic, yes, of course. I mean, he's romantic to the end, wasn't he?
Keats, Shelley,
Yeah.
Wordsworth. Gosh, there's a poem called Ode to Duty, and he's written in his handwriting, "There's only one way of happiness for man, obedience."
Yes, oh well, yes. He was inclined to be idealistic. But he felt that, you know, you had to go and fight for your country, you know, fight for God and country.
The young idealist was soon transferred to Belgium, where he came face to face with the true horrors of the war. In the space of just one critical day, Ronald Skirth would be transformed from an ardent believer in the cause to a conscientious objector. In June 1917, his battery took up position south of Ypres, in preparation for a massive artillery assault on the heavily fortified German defences at Messines Ridge. This is Lone Tree Crater, on what was then the German front line. Today, locals call it the Pool of Peace. But you wouldn't have wanted to be here early in the morning of 7th of June 1917. At 3:10 a.m, British sappers detonated 91,000 pounds of high explosive from a tunnel running directly under my feet. It was one of 19 simultaneous explosions under German positions along a 7-mile front. It was huge, and when the whole thing went up, you could hear it back in London, over 100 miles away. The scale of the craters was staggering. In just a few seconds, the Germans suffered 10,000 casualties. But this was just the beginning. For the next 14 hours, British shells thundered into the German positions. Only at 5:30 p.m. did Ronald Skirth's guns finally fall silent, with the capture of Messines Ridge. I've got here an Australian aerial reconnaissance photograph taken at 6 p.m. on the 7th of June, and you can see the smoke just beginning to clear over the German lines, which have been battered, and no man's land is devastated. It's all tree stumps and craters. On the ground, it must have been carnage. After the barrage, Ronald Skirth was sent into no man's land on a reconnaissance mission. It would be his first encounter with death. He later wrote, "It was a ghastly sight which met our eyes. I can't attempt to describe what shapes and colours human bodies assume after they've been blown sky high. Some looked like bluish-green replicas of the Michelin tire men. Others were incomplete." The young man whose head had been filled with images of a barbaric, murderous enemy was simply overwhelmed by the scale of death and suffering around him. Skirth came across a young German boy sitting down on the battlefield. He was dead, but he looked merely asleep. He had no visible wounds, and Skirth thought he looked just like himself, but in a different uniform. He was carrying a photograph of a young girl who looked exactly like Ella. She'd written in the corner of the photo, "Mein Hans." The 19-year-old Skirth said that he felt sick with shame. The sight of Hans and the thought of his distant, grieving girlfriend left Ronald with a permanently troubled conscience.
He found a picture of a young woman and it seemed to remind him of Ella, the same sort of age, you know. I think she'd written Mein Hans, yes, obviously very fond of this boy, I think.
So it's a love story like theirs.
Like theirs. Could have been there, it could have been him in the shell hole.
And did that change his attitude to the Germans?
I guess maybe he could then see that they were just the people, you know, people, whichever nationality, it was wrong. The whole idea of killing people was wrong.
For the rest of the war, Ronald Skirth considered himself a fraud, secretly containing his moral turmoil. He tried and failed to get a transfer into an ambulance unit. He refused to accept the military medal, and he turned down a commission as an officer, as he did not wish to give men orders to kill. This is the Langemark German cemetery. It contains the remains of more than 44,000 German soldiers killed at Ypres. If the body of Hans was ever recovered, it is likely to rest somewhere here. Skirth decided he couldn't tell anyone about his conscientious objection. Not his family, not his fiancée, not his fellow soldiers, who might have branded him a coward or a traitor. So he made a private pact with God. He would stay in the army, but he would put no more young Hanses into the ground. So strong was Skirth's conviction that he even claims to have performed acts of military sabotage. Acts that, if discovered, would undoubtedly have been considered treasonable. In his memoir, he records that he deliberately missed targets with his first salvo of shells, to give the enemy a chance to flee before the next barrage closed in. He says, "I got great comfort from all this, feeling a sense of power that nothing else gave me." It's quite an extraordinary admission, and it's not a comfortable one to read. Yes, he's preserving the life of the enemy, but is he in some way endangering the life of his own troops? He writes, "I felt no sense of guilt whatever." Ronald Skirth kept his conscientious objection secret, even from his wife Ella. He didn't tell her until he began writing his memoir some 50 years later. But some men decided to make their protests public, risking the wrath of their communities, their fellow soldiers, and their families. This is the British Library newspaper archive in Colindale, North London. It holds an original copy of a First World War newspaper published by conscientious objectors. It was called The Tribunal. This is an article dated Thursday, October the 3rd, 1918, and its contents are extraordinary. 2 serving officers, brothers, Captain J. Hunter and Second Lieutenant A. Hunter, tried simultaneously to resign their commissions on the grounds of conscientious objection. That was an ambitious plan, to put it mildly. You didn't just leave the war because you'd thought better of it. All honour to the 2 brothers, says the tribunal. But what actually happened to them? John and Arthur Hunter were born on the 11th of October 1890. They were identical, part of a set of triplets, with a brother, Maurice. They and their elder sister Agnes grew up in a military family in the mill town of Belper in Derbyshire. I've come to Belper to meet local historian Charles Beresford to find out more about the family.
Right, well, I've been doing some digging, and I've come across some photos of the Hunter family, and that's one that I think will interest you. That is Lieutenant Colonel Maurice Hunter, the father of the John and Arthur that you're interested in.
What a severe-looking photograph.
Absolutely.
Full moustache.
Full moustache, that's right. And for most of the war, he was involved with training in the 5th Sherwood Foresters. He was actually awarded the OBE for his services.
Oh, really?
So, yes,
it was a very serious figure.
It was a very serious figure.
Lieutenant Colonel Maurice Hunter had never seen action. At the outbreak of war, he urged his 3 sons to sign up. John Hunter was the first to join the fight. He served with the British Expeditionary Force and was among the first soldiers into France. Hunter took a camera with him. His own pictures capture the confident mood among his fellow Sherwood Foresters. But that soon changed. In 1915, John Hunter was transferred to Ypres, where the battalion suffered heavy casualties. Back in Belper, the local paper carried a testimony to his leadership.
I want to show you an article that appeared in the Belper News in September 1915. Can you just read it? Sorry.
Yeah, Captain Hunter, who was a very capable officer and intensely liked by all the men.
Yeah.
Not the sort of man you would expect to develop a conscientious objection from nowhere.
Absolutely. No indication from that whatsoever. That's right. He's just a bloody good infantry officer, doing his duty and doing it very well.
Captain Hunter led his men for 2 more harrowing years. We don't know precisely when he developed his conscientious objection, but seeing so many men killed and wounded clearly began to take its toll. I'm meeting Captain Hunter's son, Martin.
One of the things that my father had to do was actually to write letters of condolence to people who'd been killed in the regiment, and having to explain to the relatives, mother and father probably, that their son had died, and saying what a good soldier he'd been. Not an easy thing to do. He was a sensitive sort of guy. He'd seen death and destruction for 2.5 years or whatever.
And do you think the cumulative effect of doing this was just too much?
Well, I think it did build up, frankly, yes. He decided that this slaughter was madness, and he didn't want any further part in it.
In July 1918, Captain John Hunter persuaded his twin brother Arthur, then serving as a lieutenant in France, to make a joint public stand. They would resign their posts as officers. It must have been a difficult decision. Their own father was head of battalion. It was his task to encourage young men to join the fight. The army too were unimpressed. Failure to do your duty was considered not only dishonourable, it was punishable by Field General Court-Martial. At the National Archives in Kew, there is a surviving account of their trial proceedings. This is a record of the court-martial held on the 12th of July 1918 in Calais, and it records that the brothers were both charged with conduct to the prejudice of good order and military discipline. And in addition, John was charged with disobeying a lawful command given by his superior officer. He was told to go up the line to the front and join his men, and he refused to do so. That's an incredibly serious charge. Men were shot for less. The Hunter brothers were found guilty and cashiered. That is, dismissed from the army with dishonour. In addition, John Hunter was sentenced to a year's hard labour. Perhaps they were lucky. Some would consider their punishment lenient by military standards of the day. John, though, was appalled. From his prison cell, he wrote a letter to the Home Office, protesting that this was no way to treat an officer and a gentleman. John and Arthur's sentences were, however, published in the London Gazette, the official mouthpiece of the army. It was a very public humiliation. How did the boys' decision to resign affect the family?
They were totally devastated. Their father had a high position in Belper, well-respected boys doing their turn at the front, and then not just one, but two of them packed it in. And, well, frankly, it was a disgrace to a lieutenant colonel.
Did they ever manage to rebuild their relationship with their father?
I don't think my father did. I think he was ostracised, if that's the right word. My grandfather cut contact, and I don't think the family recovered. The whole thing is, in my view, a total sadness, really.
Back in Belper, the community was no less forgiving. Like all conchies, the brothers lost their right to vote. And nobody would employ them. John could only find part-time work as a door-to-door salesman. Arthur eventually emigrated. At Highfields, the Hunter family home, their father struggled to come to terms with the stigma of his son's actions. We've discovered an editorial on the Hunter case from a local Belper paper in 1918. The copy's pretty grimy, but the content is remarkable, because basically it reads like an obituary. It says, there is widespread sympathy with Colonel Maurice Hunter in the blow, and that's the word they use, which has fallen on his family through his two sons being dismissed from the army. And then it goes through their military career as though they were dead, and ends up again offering sympathy to Colonel and Mrs. Hunter, their relatives and friends. Given that this piece is surrounded by accounts of other local Belper men killed in action, you do get the feeling that it would have been better if the Hunter brothers had died too. Lieutenant Colonel Hunter never forgave his sons. While he maintained close contact with the third triplet, Maurice, who stayed in the army, he shunned John and Arthur. Until his death in 1946, it appears he never spoke to them again. For men like Lieutenant Colonel Hunter, conscientious objection was just an elaborate phrase for cowardice. This is Tynecott Cemetery near Ypres. It's the largest and most visited Commonwealth War cemetery in the world, honouring the lives of more than 47,000 fallen soldiers. In the context of this enormous sacrifice, this vast roll call of the dead, how should we remember the conscientious objectors? The 16,000 men who refused to fight. In June 1917, Captain Stephen Gwynne, an MP and serving officer who'd experienced the horrors of the battlefield here at Ypres, addressed the House of Commons on the subject of conscientious objectors. This is what he said: "There is one thing that nobody can deny them, and that is courage. The most difficult form of courage in the world, the courage of the individual against the crowd." I think he's right, and I think it's also right that these individuals too are not forgotten.
Also not forgotten are the 45,000 men who built an underground world in that Belgian cornfield, discovering the lost World War I bunker. A Time Team special up next.